Richard Rich, acting alongside the sitting Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, remains a chilling anomaly in English history. As a high-ranking minister who personally operated a torture machine to break a woman's bones, as a senior member of the King's Privy Council, Rich took off his robes and manually stretched Anne Askew's joints until her body was destroyed. Beyond physical torture, he used blatant perjury to secure the death penalty for England's greatest statesman, Thomas More. Rich stood in court and swore on the Bible to deliver a fabricated testimony that sent his former mentor to the execution block. Today we investigate the corrupt politician who used fake evidence and physical dismemberment to survive 4 different Tudor monarchs. Tudor England was a strict society built on inherited titles and land. People believed in a divine order that assigned everyone a permanent social rank at birth. You were either born an aristocrat with the king's favor, or you were a commoner. Moving up to a higher class was rarely an option. Without a noble background, gaining political power was extremely difficult. The path to success was narrow and full of risks. Commoners had to rely entirely on pleasing powerful superiors to get ahead. Trying to gain influence without a famous family name was dangerous, and sudden downfalls were common. Richard Rich was born around 1496 into the middle of the London merchant class. His family lived in St. Lawrence Jury, a wealthy neighborhood in the city's commercial center. They were not nobles, but they were financially secure. His great-grandfather sold expensive fabrics and had served as a city sheriff in 1441. But in the highly stratified, deeply snobbish world of the early 1500s, commercial success was not the equivalent of noble prestige. A rich merchant was, at the end of the day, still just a merchant. He was a man who worked for his money, a concept that the ancient nobility found inherently vulgar. Richard Rich did not have a single drop of aristocratic blue blood in his veins. He had no ancient title to inherit, no ancestral castles to retreat to, and no vast armies of loyal tenant farmers to summon in times of crisis. He was a commoner. For an ambitious young man like Richard Rich, this lack of aristocratic pedigree bred a profound inferiority complex. He recognized early on that without an inherited title, his political survival depended entirely on navigating the brutal mechanics of Tudor law. As he walked the muddy, crowded streets of London and looked toward the glittering palaces of Westminster, he was acutely, painfully aware that the great lords of the realm, ancient, powerful men like the Duke of Norfolk or the Earl of Surrey, looked down on him as a jumped-up, insignificant commoner with ink on his fingers and a ledger in his hand. This deep-seated social anxiety, this burning resentment of his own birth, forged his entire worldview. He realized very early in his life that he could not rely on ancient family connections, noble cousins, or the traditional bonds of feudal loyalty to protect him or advance his career. If a nobleman fell from grace, he had vast estates and a private army to fall back on. If Richard Rich fell, he had nothing but the cobblestones of London. Therefore, Rich completely rejected the concept of a chivalric court bound by honor. He instead operated within the political sphere as if it were a ruthless transactional marketplace, calculating every move for personal gain. Human loyalty was not a virtue. It was just another form of currency to be spent, traded, or hoarded when it was mathematically necessary. Morality, religious principle, and personal honor were expensive, highly dangerous luxuries They were weights that dragged a man down. Rich was a survivor, and since he did not have the luxury of an inherited sword or a private army, his chosen weapon for conquering the Tudor court would be the law. Understanding that education was the only viable ladder out of the merchant class, Rich spent a brief period at Cambridge University before moving to the Middle Temple in London around 1516 to study English common law. The Middle Temple was one of the prestigious Inns of Court. It was a highly competitive intellectual training ground for the greatest, sharpest legal minds of England. It was a place where ambitious young men debated centuries of legal precedent, dissected parliamentary legislation, and learned the intricate Byzantine rules of the English legal system. But during his time there, Richard Rich did not stand out for his profound academic brilliance, his deep philosophical understanding of jurisprudence, or his dedication to the concept of justice. He stood out primarily for his glaring, unmistakable character flaws. Sir Thomas More, one of the most brilliant, internationally respected legal philosophers and humanist scholars of the Renaissance age, lived in the very same London parish where Richard Rich grew up. More was a titan of the English legal system, a man of profound intellect and unshakable religious conviction. More had known Richard Rich from his youth. He had watched the young man grow up in the neighborhood and navigate the halls of the legal establishment. Years later, in 1535, when Sir Thomas More was standing trial for his life in Westminster Hall, facing the terrifying prospect of a traitor's death, he would publicly, devastatingly describe the young lawyer to the face of the entire Tudor establishment. More stated in open court with absolute unmasked contempt that Rich was light of tongue, a great gamester, and of no commendable fame. In the polite, highly coded legal language of the 16th century, More was identifying Richard Rich as a hustler. He was a gambler, a fast talker, a man known for running up debts, cutting corners, and seeking the company of disreputable, untrustworthy people. He was a young man desperately, almost pathologically looking for a shortcut to the top of the social ladder, completely uninterested in the slow, honorable, and poorly compensated path of honest legal scholarship. Thomas More recognized a parasite, and that recognition would eventually cost More his head. In the highly paranoid, constantly shifting, and lethally dangerous politics of King Henry VIII's court, a man without a powerful political patron was completely invisible. Merit alone meant absolutely nothing. You could be the most brilliant lawyer in England, but if you did not have a lord pulling you up the ladder, you would rot in obscurity. The entire Tudor government functioned on a strict system of patronage. Lords protected and promoted their clients, and in return, the clients executed the lord's will. Rich spent the 1520s desperately, almost pathetically, trying to secure a powerful backer to pull him out of the merchant class. In 1526, he ran for the position of common sergeant in London, a respectable legal post, but he failed completely, lacking the necessary political backing. By 1528, his desperation became palpable. He wrote sycophantic letters to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's incredibly powerful, intimidating chief minister. Rich practically begged for a position, offering unsolicited amateurish ideas on legal reform in a frantic attempt to prove his usefulness. Wolsey, a veteran political operator who likely recognized the raw ambition behind the young lawyer's fawning letters, threw Rich a minor, unimpressive role. He made him a local peace commissioner in the county of Essex. It was a start, but it was not nearly enough to satisfy Rich's towering, consuming ambition. He needed a stronger, faster horse to ride. His real, kingdom-altering break finally came when he attached himself like a remora to a rising, highly effective political star, Thomas Audley. Audley was a man on the make, rapidly ascending the legal ranks of the Tudor establishment. Rich recognized Audley's upward trajectory and made himself indispensable. He acted as Audley's political fixer, handling the messy, on-the-ground legal details and helping him secure local strategic victories in the counties. In exchange for this subservience, Audley utilized his own rising influence to pull Rich up the legal hierarchy of the Tudor establishment with him. When King Henry VIII summoned the famous world-changing Reformation Parliament in 1529, the specific parliament designed to pressure the Pope into granting the king a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Audley ensured that Richard Rich was elected as a member of Parliament for the town of Colchester. Rich finally had his foot firmly wedged in the door of absolute state power. He was now sitting in the legislative chamber where the future of the English nation was being violently rewritten. Once inside the actual machinery of the Tudor government, Rich's true genius became apparent. His genius was not the law, his genius was survival. He possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural, and highly predatory instinct for reading the political winds. He could sense power shifting before it even happened. As he sat in Parliament, he quickly identified that the real, absolute power in England was rapidly, permanently shifting away from the old, conservative Catholic nobility, like the Duke of Norfolk, and moving directly toward the king's ruthless, highly efficient, and terrifyingly intelligent new chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Rich realized that Cromwell was the future. Cromwell was the architect of the king's supremacy, the man designing the legal machinery to break the English church away from Rome. Without a second thought, Rich completely abandoned his previous, weaker alliances and aligned himself entirely enthusiastically with Cromwell. He offered himself to Cromwell not just as a lawyer, but as a weapon. The king's legal attack dog. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Cromwell recognized in Richard Rich a man completely unburdened by conscience, religious conviction, or professional honor, the exact type of man the state needed to enforce highly unpopular dictatorial laws. By October 1533, the merchant's son from St. Lawrence Jury had finally broken through the invisible wall. He was knighted by King Henry VIII. He was officially appointed Solicitor General of England. He was no longer a hustling lawyer in the Middle Temple. He was now the chief legal attack dog for the English crown. His primary, explicit job description was terrifyingly simple. He was tasked with legally justifying King Henry VIII's violent, unprecedented break from the Catholic Church, and he was required to legally, systematically execute anyone, no matter how holy, how brilliant, or how beloved, who dared to stand in the king's way. Richard Rich had secured his power. Now he simply had to pay for it with the blood of better men. As the newly minted Solicitor General of England, Richard Rich was not appointed to uphold the blind, impartial scales of justice. He was appointed to be the tip of the king's spear. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell had fundamentally rewritten the English legal code to consolidate absolute tyrannical power over the minds of their subjects. The most terrifying weapon in their arsenal was the Treason Act of 1534. This draconian legislation fundamentally altered the definition of treason. It was no longer necessary to raise a rebel army or plot a physical assassination to be executed. Under the new act, simply speaking words that denied the king's new title as supreme head of the Church of England was a capital offense. But even with this terrifying law in place, the state faced a massive, deeply embarrassing legal hurdle. The most prominent, respected men in the kingdom, men whose defiance threatened to completely delegitimize the king's religious revolution in the eyes of Catholic Europe, were brilliant legal minds. They knew that to be convicted of treason by words, they actually had to speak the words, so they simply remained completely, resolutely silent. Richard Rich's job was to break that silence. He did not use physical torture, not yet. He used something far more insidious. He weaponized human trust. His first true masterpiece of legal deception involved the frail, deeply pious 80-year-old Bishop John Fisher of Rochester. Bishop Fisher was a titan of the old Catholic order. He had bravely, stubbornly defended the legal and theological rights of the king's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, during the agonizing divorce proceedings. Because of his unyielding principles, he had been locked in the damp, freezing, rat-infested dungeons of the Tower of London. When the Pope in Rome sent Fisher a cardinal's hat to protect him, it only enraged King Henry VIII further. But the king's prosecutors were stuck. Fisher had refused to take the oath of supremacy, but he had explicitly used his legal right to remain silent on the matter. Without an overt, spoken statement of denial, they could not legally execute an 80-year-old cardinal without looking like lawless butchers. On May 7, 1535, Richard Rich visited Bishop Fisher in his cell. Rich did not arrive flanked by armed guards, and he did not act like a hostile state interrogator. Instead, he executed a calculated and highly manipulative interrogation tactic. He played the role of a conflicted, highly sympathetic, and deeply confidential friend of the court. Rich swore on his personal honor as a gentleman and a knight that he carried a secret, highly sensitive, and strictly off-the-record message directly from King Henry himself. Rich leaned in and promised the exhausted, freezing bishop that the king was privately struggling with his conscience. He claimed the king merely wanted the respected bishop's private, honest, theological advice regarding the spiritual validity of the royal supremacy. Rich gave his absolute, solemn, unbreakable word before God that nothing Fisher said in the privacy of that cell would ever be recorded, reported to the council, or used against him in a court of law. It was, Rich promised, a matter of a king seeking spiritual counsel from a priest. Bishop Fisher, a man of profound religious integrity, who lived his entire life bound by sacred oaths, made the fatal mistake of believing that a Tudor lawyer possessed the same moral compass. Trusting the solemn promise of a fellow high-ranking official, the elderly Fisher finally spoke his mind. He stated clearly that, according to the laws of God and the history of the Church, he did not believe a secular king could ever be the spiritual head of the Church of England. Rich had his prize. He immediately walked out of the cell, went directly to the Crown prosecutors and used that highly confidential, legally and morally protected conversation as the sole damning evidence of high treason. He offered himself as the primary witness for the prosecution. Because of Rich's blatant, sickening deception, Bishop John Fisher was dragged out of the Tower and brutally beheaded on Tower Hill on June 22, 1535. If the deception of Fisher was a masterpiece of entrapment, Rich's next assignment was a display of absolute premeditated perjury. The target was a man recognized across the entire European continent for his towering intellect, Sir Thomas More. More, the former Lord Chancellor of England and the brilliant author of Utopia, was the ultimate prize for the Tudor regime. If they could break Thomas More, they could break anyone. But More was not just a philosopher. He was one of the greatest lawyers in English history. Imprisoned in the Tower for refusing the oath, More used his absolute silence as an impenetrable, flawless legal shield. He refused to speak against the king's marriage, and he refused to speak against the king's supremacy. The state prosecution led by Thomas Cromwell was completely humiliatingly stalled. They had absolutely no legal grounds to execute a man who simply refused to speak. The trial of the century was about to collapse. On June 12, 1535, Richard Rich entered More's cell. He was accompanied by Richard Southwell and a servant named Palmer. Their official, highly vindictive, bureaucratic excuse for the visit was to pack up More's beloved books and writing materials, effectively stripping the great intellectual of his final meager comforts in the dark. While the servants were distracted, carrying out the heavy leather-bound books, Rich engaged More in a casual hypothetical debate about the limits of parliamentary power. Rich asked More a philosophical question. If Parliament passed a law making Richard Rich the king, would More accept him as king? More agreed that he would, as Parliament could determine the succession. Rich then asked if Parliament could pass a law making Richard Rich the Pope. More, a cautious, brilliant legal mind who knew exactly what the Solicitor General was attempting to do, navigated the hypothetical questions with extreme care. He was exceptionally careful not to say a single actionable treasonous word about Henry VIII's supremacy. When More's highly public trial convened in Westminster Hall on July 1, 1535, the prosecution was desperate. They had presented their evidence, and More had effortlessly, brilliantly dismantled every single charge. He was winning his own trial. The entire Tudor legal apparatus was on the verge of a massive, embarrassing defeat. Richard Rich was called to the witness stand. He stepped up, placed his hand on the Holy Bible, and looked directly at the judges. And then he committed blatant, premeditated perjury that would stain his name for the rest of recorded history. He swore under oath that during their conversation in the cell, Thomas More had explicitly, definitively stated that Parliament had absolutely no power to make the king the supreme head of the church. The crowded, echoing courtroom fell dead silent. Everyone in that room, the judges, the jury, the lords, and the king's council, knew Thomas More. They knew he was far too brilliant, far too cautious, and far too disciplined a lawyer to have ever made such a stupid, blatantly treasonous statement to the king's own Solicitor General while his books were being packed away. Thomas More looked directly at the man who had just knowingly, eagerly signed his death warrant. More did not beg for his life. He did not scream, panic, or curse. Instead, he delivered a crushing eternal indictment of Richard Rich's soul. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying the absolute weight of moral superiority. If this oath of yours, Master Rich, be true, then pray I that I may never see God in the face. In good faith, Master Rich, I am sorrier for your perjury than for my own peril. To drive the point home and expose the lie, More turned to the judges and reminded them of Rich's lifelong reputation as a gambler and a liar in the parish where they both grew up, stating that no one in their right mind would ever trust Richard Rich with a state secret, let alone a confession of high treason. Rich, visibly sweating and desperate to corroborate his lie, demanded that his companions Southwell and Palmer be called to testify. They were brought to the stand. Terrified of committing perjury before God, but equally terrified of crossing the murderous wrath of the crown, they awkwardly, cowardly claimed that they had been too busy packing the books to hear the conversation. They refused to lie, but they refused to call the Solicitor General a liar. The damage, however, was already done. Rich's lie provided the thin, transparent legal cover the intimidated jury needed to deliver the verdict the king demanded. His perjury was the legal axe that severed Thomas More's head on July 6, 1535. Richard Rich had successfully crossed a moral event horizon by actively committing perjury to secure the execution of the greatest mind of his generation. He had definitively proven to King Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell that there was absolutely no line he would not cross for the crown. He had proven that his soul was entirely, unconditionally for sale. In the brutally transactional world of the Tudor court, providing the king with the severed head of his greatest intellectual rival required a massive, unprecedented financial payout. The crown did not pay Rich with a mere bag of gold or a temporary pension. They paid him with the keys to the greatest accumulation of wealth in English history. In 1536, as a direct, tangible reward for his perjury, Richard Rich was appointed as the very first Chancellor of the Court of Augmentations. Grasping the sheer terrifying scale of the economic power Rich now wielded requires a close examination of the specific administrative purpose behind the Court of Augmentations. Following Henry VIII's break with Rome, the king ordered the dissolution of the monasteries. For over 5 centuries, the Catholic Church in England had accumulated staggering, almost unfathomable amounts of wealth. They owned roughly 1/3 of all the land in England. They possessed massive ancient abbeys, sprawling agricultural estates, jewel-encrusted shrines, and literal tons of gold and silver plate. King Henry VIII, nearly bankrupt from his extravagant lifestyle and foreign wars, decided to steal absolutely all of it. The Court of Augmentations was the bespoke administrative engine designed exclusively to manage, catalog, and liquidate this massive looted wealth. As the chancellor of this court, Richard Rich was effectively the chief accountant, the primary liquidator, and the ultimate gatekeeper of a nationalized fortune. He was the man who evaluated the lands, stripped the lead off the abbey roofs, melted down the sacred chalices, and sold the estates to the highest bidder. The French ambassador in London, Charles de Marillac, observed Rich's ruthless, greedy administrative efficiency with absolute disgust. In his diplomatic dispatches to the French king, Marillac accurately and contemptuously described Richard Rich as the most wretched of all England, the inventor of the destruction of the abbeys. Rich used this unparalleled, completely unregulated executive position to gorge himself on confiscated Catholic wealth. He did not simply manage the king's money, he systematically skimmed, embezzled, and directed the flow of prime real estate directly into his own pockets. He used his position as chancellor to purchase massive tracts of land at heavily, suspiciously discounted rates. He seized the highly lucrative estate of St. Bartholomew the Great in the center of London, transforming it from a religious hospital into his own personal urban property. But his most symbolic, aggressive, and psychologically revealing acquisition was Lees Priory in his home county of Essex. Lees Priory had been a peaceful, ancient Augustinian monastery for centuries. Rich purchased it in 1536. He immediately evicted the monks, seized the surrounding agricultural land, and ruthlessly ordered the total demolition of the ancient religious buildings. Upon the desecrated ruins of the abbey, he used his newly acquired blood-soaked wealth to build a massive, sprawling, magnificent red brick Tudor mansion for his growing family. It was a physical, architectural manifestation of his entire worldview. He literally built his domestic palace upon the crushed bones and shattered altars of the old world. By the end of his tenure in the Court of Augmentations, this former merchant's son from the crowded streets of London owned over 100 manors, farms, and estates spread across the county of Essex. He had successfully, ruthlessly bought his way into the landed aristocracy. He possessed the staggering, generation-spanning wealth of a great lord. But wealth in Tudor England did not guarantee safety. He still lived in a paranoid world where a single political misstep, a whispered rumor, or a sudden shift in the king's mood could cost him everything, including his head. He had the money, but he still needed to survive the monsters he worked for. A man who fundamentally builds his entire existence on deception, perjury, and the looting of sacred spaces possesses no genuine loyalty to anyone. Not to his God, not to his king, and absolutely not to the men who elevated him from obscurity. Thomas Cromwell, the king's terrifyingly intelligent chief minister, was the patron who had essentially handed Richard Rich the keys to the kingdom. Cromwell had discovered him in Parliament, promoted him to Solicitor General, protected him from his aristocratic enemies, and brought him into the king's highly exclusive inner circle. In the vicious, cutthroat ecosystem of the Tudor court, Thomas Cromwell was Richard Rich's political father. But in the early summer of 1540, the untouchable Thomas Cromwell made a fatal, catastrophic political miscalculation. Cromwell had aggressively pushed King Henry VIII into a diplomatic and political marriage with a German Protestant princess, Anne of Cleves. The goal was to secure a massive, unified Protestant alliance against the looming threat of the Catholic powers of Europe. However, when Henry VIII finally met Anne in person, he found her physically repulsive. He famously, bitterly complained that he liked her not, and the marriage was an absolute, humiliating disaster. The king was furious, deeply embarrassed, and looking for someone to blame for forcing him into a politically disastrous and personally humiliating bed. Cromwell's bitter, long-standing enemies, the conservative Catholic faction led by Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, instantly began to circle the wounded chief minister. They had waited a decade for Cromwell to stumble. Now, They smelled blood in the water, and they moved in for the kill. Richard Rich, possessing his terrifying predatory instinct for reading the shifting political winds, realized immediately that Cromwell's ship was going down, and it was going to drag everyone attached to it to the bottom of the ocean. Rich did not hesitate for a single second to save his own skin. He did not attempt to defend the man who had made him. He did not offer legal counsel or political support. Instead, he immediately, coldly turned his political gun directly on his benefactor. To completely destroy a man as powerful and legally entrenched as Thomas Cromwell, the conservative faction needed insider testimony. They needed someone close to Cromwell, someone who knew how the machinery of his government worked, to provide the legal ammunition. Richard Rich eagerly volunteered. He met with the conservative lords and provided devastating, highly sensationalized, and almost certainly fabricated testimony claiming that Cromwell was severely abusing his executive power. Rich swore that Cromwell was secretly, treasonously shielding radical Protestant heretics from the king's justice. Worse, Rich claimed that Cromwell had treasonously stated that if the king ever turned against the Protestant Reformation, Cromwell would fight the king in the field with his own sword. Because of Rich's devastating betrayal, Cromwell was not even granted the dignity of a trial where he could defend himself or cross-examine his accuser. He was condemned by an act of attainder, a brutal, highly corrupt legislative mechanism that allowed the state to declare a man guilty of treason and execute him by a simple vote of Parliament, bypassing the courts entirely. From his dark, damp cell in the Tower of London, a devastated, terrified Thomas Cromwell wrote a bitter, pleading, heartbreaking letter to King Henry VIII, desperately begging for mercy. In that letter, Cromwell specifically mentioned Richard Rich's catastrophic betrayal, writing a line that echoed with the agony of a man stabbed in the back by his own protege. "What he hath been to me, only God, and he knoweth best." The king, consumed by his own wounded pride, ignored the plea. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Tudor state, was brutally beheaded on Tower Hill on July 28, 1540. The executioner was notoriously incompetent, taking multiple hacks to sever the neck. Richard Rich did not mourn. He did not attend the execution. He simply stepped over the bleeding, mutilated corpse of his mentor and moved on to his next target, seamlessly, effortlessly integrating himself into the new conservative Catholic power structure that had just murdered his patron. For the vast majority of his career, Richard Rich's crimes were committed with ink, parchment, and whispered lies from the absolute safety of a comfortable wood-paneled desk. He was the ultimate sanitized bureaucratic killer. He kept his own aristocratic hands physically clean, while the executioner's heavy axe or the hangman's rope did the actual, messy, bone-crushing work of the state. He was a man who signed death warrants, not a man who wielded the blade. But in the sweltering summer of 1546, the carefully constructed facade of the civilized, highly educated London lawyer completely shattered, publicly revealing the terrifying, unrestrained monster operating just beneath the surface. The political chameleon revealed a deeply sick, sadistic capacity for direct, physical cruelty that shocked even the hardened, brutalized sensibilities of the Tudor court. By 1546, King Henry VIII was a dying tyrant. He was morbidly obese, constantly in excruciating agony from a festering ulcerated wound on his leg, and his legendary temper had devolved into outright lethal paranoia. As the king's health rapidly failed, the royal court deeply and violently fractured into two warring factions, both fighting desperately for control of the future. On one side were the radical Protestant reformers. On the other were the conservative Catholics, a faction that Richard Rich currently enthusiastically supported. The conservative faction knew that if the king died, his sixth and final wife, the highly educated Protestant-leaning Queen Catherine Parr, would wield massive, perhaps insurmountable influence over the young heir to the throne, Prince Edward. To protect their own power, the conservatives decided they had to utterly destroy the queen. To destroy a reigning queen, they needed a confession. They needed specific, legally actionable and undeniable evidence that Catherine Parr and her elite inner circle of aristocratic noblewomen were actively reading banned heretical Protestant books. To acquire this lethal evidence, Richard Rich and his allies targeted a young, highly outspoken, and deeply committed Protestant preacher and poet named Anne Askew. Anne Askew was not a typical Tudor woman. She was a gentlewoman of high birth who had abandoned a violently abusive conservative husband in Lincolnshire to travel to London. She distributed banned Protestant literature, openly preached the Reformed gospel, and engaged in fierce, highly intelligent theological debates with the conservative clergy. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, and completely unapologetic about her religious convictions. The conservative faction arrested her and threw her into the darkest dungeons of the Tower of London. Richard Rich and his political allies interrogated her relentlessly. They did not care about her theology. They cared exclusively about her social connections. They demanded hour after hour that she name the high-ranking noblewomen in the Queen's private inner circle who secretly shared and funded her heretical beliefs. They wanted the names that would allow them to topple Catherine Parr and send her to the executioner's block. Anne Askew, displaying an astonishing, unbreakable moral courage that Richard Rich could not even fathom, absolutely refused to speak. She used her own brilliant legal mind and deep knowledge of the scriptures to mock their theological arguments. She categorically refused to betray another human being to save herself. Frustrated, deeply enraged by her defiance, and desperate for the names that would secure their political supremacy, Richard Rich crossed a line that horrified the entire nation and permanently stained his legacy. He ordered Anne Askew to be placed on the rack. The rack was the most feared, psychologically terrifying instrument of torture in the Tower of London. It was a heavy, horizontal wooden frame fitted with rotating wooden rollers at both ends. The victim was laid flat on their back across the frame, and their wrists and ankles were tied tightly to the rollers with heavy, coarse ropes. A terrifying mechanical system of iron ratchets and wooden levers was used to slowly, mechanically crank the rollers in opposite directions. The machine was designed to slowly stretch the human body until the muscles tore, the ligaments snapped like violin strings, and the major joints, the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees, violently dislocated from their sockets. Under English common law, torture was highly restricted and legally questionable. It could only be authorized by a direct warrant from the King's Privy Council. But far more importantly, the cultural, moral, and legal norms of the 16th century explicitly, absolutely forbade the torturing of women. It was considered an unspeakable, barbaric, and cowardly atrocity, even by the incredibly violent, blood-soaked standards of Tudor justice. When Askew was brought down into the subterranean torture chamber, the lieutenant of the tower, Sir Anthony Knivet, was ordered to operate the machine. Knivet was a hardened military administrator, a veteran entirely accustomed to interrogating and executing male traitors for the crown without a single second thought. But when he looked at the young, defenseless noblewoman bound to the wooden frame, he was so utterly sickened by the explicit order to rack her that he flatly, directly, refused to follow the command of his political superiors. Knivet categorically refused to turn the heavy iron levers to break a woman's body, risking his own life and career in the process. He actually turned his back on Richard Rich, stormed out of the torture chamber, and rode his horse at top speed to find the king to seek a royal pardon, terrified of the legal and spiritual consequences of what was happening in his prison. But Richard Rich did not stop the interrogation. He and his primary political ally, the Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, were left alone in the damp, freezing dungeon with the executioners and the bound woman. Enraged by Knivet's insubordination, humiliated by Askew's steadfast silence, and driven by a desperate, sociopathic need to extract the names, the two highest legal officers in the entire kingdom made a decision that defies human comprehension. They took off their heavy, luxurious velvet robes of state. In their fine linen shirt sleeves, sweating in the damp, claustrophobic air of the dungeon, Richard Rich and Thomas Wriothesley physically stepped up to the machine themselves. They placed their own aristocratic, well-manicured hands on the heavy wooden levers. They frantically, violently cranked the iron gears themselves, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of aristocratic dignity. Throwing their entire body weight directly into the wooden levers, the two senior politicians slowly and methodically stretched Anne Askew's body across the frame, continuing the relentless mechanical pressure until her major joints audibly popped completely out of their sockets. Askew later recorded in her smuggled, heartbreaking letters that they kept her on the rack for an excruciatingly long time, ignoring her agony, demanding names, and inflicting catastrophic, permanent physical damage on a helpless woman. Yet despite the catastrophic physical trauma and the systemic destruction of her joints on the rack, Anne Askew never broke her silence. She did not scream for mercy. She gave them absolutely no names. She protected the Queen and her friends with her own broken body. Richard Rich physically destroyed her physical form, but he could not break her iron will. Because her joints were completely severed, Anne Askew could no longer walk or even stand upright on her ruined legs. On July 16, 1546, Richard Rich ordered that she be carried in a wooden chair through the streets of London to the execution grounds at Smithfield. He stood safely in the crowd, surrounded by guards, watching with cold bureaucratic detachment as she was chained to a heavy wooden post, still sitting in her chair because her legs were useless, and burned alive at the stake. Rich had committed one of the most heinous, illegal, and personally sadistic acts of the entire Tudor era. Yet while Anne Askew's ashes blew across the London skyline, Richard Rich simply washed his hands, put his velvet robes back on, and returned to the political chessboard, preparing for his next grand betrayal. King Henry VIII, the massive, terrifying, and unpredictable center of the Tudor universe, finally died in January 1547. He left behind a fractured, paranoid kingdom, a terrified nobility, and a fragile 9-year-old son, King Edward VI. In the immediate, chaotic power vacuum following Henry's death, the government of England was swiftly and ruthlessly seized by a radical Protestant faction. This faction was led by the young king's ambitious uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, who immediately appointed himself Lord Protector of the realm. For a man like Richard Rich, a man deeply entrenched in the conservative Catholic faction, a man who had just months prior physically tortured a famous Protestant woman to death to protect Catholic interests, this sudden, violent shift to a radical Protestant regime should have been a fatal political death sentence. By all laws of political gravity, Richard Rich should have been immediately purged from the council, stripped of his lands, imprisoned in the Tower, or executed for his crimes. Instead, he executed the most breathtaking, shameless, and brilliant political pivot of his entire career. Richard Rich instantly entirely discarded his conservative Catholic alliances. He abandoned his former friends and ideological patrons without a second thought, leaving them to face the wrath of the new regime. He rebranded himself overnight. He presented himself to Edward Seymour not as a Catholic inquisitor, but as an enthusiastic, deeply committed, and highly vocal Protestant reformer who had merely been following the old king's orders against his own conscience. He threw his full, considerable legal weight and his vast wealth behind the new Lord Protector. In the Tudor court, absolute shamelessness was a highly rewarded virtue. Edward Seymour desperately needed experienced, ruthless legal administrators to manage the complex machinery of government and suppress the inevitable Catholic uprisings that his radical reforms would spark. Rich's complete lack of morality made him the perfect tool. His betrayal of his former Catholic allies was rewarded spectacularly by the new Protestant regime. In February 1547, just weeks after the old king's death, he was elevated to the highest ranks of the peerage. The merchant's son from St. Lawrence Jury officially became the first Baron Rich of Lees. He had finally achieved his lifelong obsession. He was officially a nobleman of the realm, but the ultimate crowning prize came in October of that same year. Richard Rich was officially appointed Lord Chancellor of England. This was the absolute highest, most prestigious, and most powerful legal and political office in the entire kingdom. It was the exact same seat of power that his victim, the brilliant Sir Thomas More, had once occupied. The man who had committed perjury, embezzled state funds, and personally tortured a woman on the rack was now the supreme head of the English judiciary. The historical irony is deeply nauseating. As the Lord Chancellor of a radical Protestant regime, Richard Rich was now actively drafting legislation to smash ancient Catholic altars, burn sacred Catholic relics, dissolve the chantries, and enforce strict, uncompromising Protestant doctrine across the country. The very man who had burned Anne Askew for denying the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation was now actively imprisoning, fining, and destroying people who supported that exact same doctrine. Richard Rich did not care about theology. He did not care about the soul. He cared exclusively about power, survival, and real estate. God was simply another political patron to be swapped out when the regime changed. But the radical Protestant regime of the young King Edward VI was highly unstable. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, proved to be an arrogant, dictatorial, and ultimately incompetent ruler. He alienated the rest of the nobility with his high-handed tactics, and his disastrous economic policies provoked massive, bloody peasant rebellions across the English countryside, most notably Kett's Rebellion in 1549. By the autumn of 1549, a highly organized counter-coup was orchestrated by a far more ruthless and highly capable politician within the Privy Council, John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, and later the Duke of Northumberland. Once again, Richard Rich sensed the terrifying shifting of the tectonic plates beneath the royal court. He saw that Edward Seymour was politically isolated and bleeding power. He seamlessly, effortlessly switched sides, abandoning the man who had made him a baron. As Lord Chancellor, Rich actively, enthusiastically participated in the downfall of his former patron. Rich personally used his brilliant legal mind to draft the very legal documents, the highly sensationalized treason charges, and the articles of impeachment that were used to depose, arrest, and ultimately execute Edward Seymour. Rich aligned himself firmly with the victorious John Dudley, but Dudley was a fundamentally dangerous, highly volatile, and dangerously ambitious man. As the young King Edward VI's health began to visibly fail from a severe terminal lung infection, likely tuberculosis, Dudley began to drive the country toward a massive, catastrophic succession crisis to maintain his own grip on power. By late 1551, Richard Rich, possessing the acute, hypersensitive survival instincts of a cornered predator, realized that John Dudley was flying too close to the sun. Dudley's ship was eventually going to sink, and it was going to drag everyone attached to it down to the executioner's block. Rich needed an exit strategy, and he executed a brilliantly, cowardly, flawlessly timed tactical retreat. He faked a severe, debilitating physical illness. He claimed that the heavy, crushing burdens of state had destroyed his health and that he was nearing death. To ensure he was permanently removed from the immediate line of fire, his sudden exit was precipitated by a catastrophic administrative error. Rich intended to send a highly sensitive warning letter to his political ally, the Duke of Somerset. However, his servant mistakenly delivered this confidential document directly into the hands of Somerset's bitter political rival, the Duke of Northumberland. For a man of Rich's meticulous, paranoid intelligence, such a massive error was completely out of character. It was a manufactured excuse, using this feigned illness and highly suspicious incompetence as a shield. He formally resigned the office of Lord Chancellor on December 21st, 1551. He effectively stepped completely out of the kill zone. He retreated to the safety of his massive, heavily fortified estates in Essex, hoarding his immense wealth and watching the royal court tear itself apart from a very safe distance. His timing, as always, was completely flawless. In July 1553, the 15-year-old King Edward VI died. John Dudley, in a desperate, highly illegal bid to maintain Protestant control over the government and to save his own head from the Catholic heir, attempted to completely bypass the legitimate succession established by Henry VIII's will. Dudley placed his own teenage daughter-in-law, the highly educated Protestant Lady Jane Grey, on the throne, deliberately bypassing the king's Catholic half-sister, Princess Mary. Richard Rich was immediately summoned by Dudley. Initially, under heavy coercion and military threat from Dudley's forces in London, Rich signed the official state document supporting Lady Jane Grey's ascension to the throne. But Rich immediately left the capital and rode fast for the safety of his estates in Essex. From his manor house, he coldly monitored the military situation unfolding across the country. The exact moment he saw that the Catholic Princess Mary was successfully rallying massive, overwhelming military support in the eastern counties, Rich dropped Lady Jane Grey entirely. He rode out into the center of Essex, used his vast wealth to raise local troops, and publicly loudly declared his absolute dying loyalty to the Catholic Princess Mary. He even hosted the new Catholic Queen at his lavish estate at Wanstead as she marched triumphantly on London to take her throne. John Dudley's rebellion collapsed. Dudley was beheaded. The innocent teenage lady, Jane Grey, was beheaded. Richard Rich, the man who had initially signed the document supporting the treason, survived without a single scratch. By the late summer of 1553, the political landscape of England had violently inverted once again. The radical Protestant regime of the boy King Edward VI had collapsed, and the zealous, deeply traumatized Catholic Queen, Mary I, had successfully seized the throne. Queen Mary was a woman defined entirely by her suffering. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had been bastardized, humiliated, and separated from her mother by the very men who had built the Tudor police state. Now that she possessed absolute power, she was absolutely determined to reverse the Protestant Reformation, crush the heretics who had destroyed her family, and drag the nation of England back into the loving, suffocating embrace of the Catholic Church in Rome. For a man like Richard Rich, who had spent the last 6 years as a radical Protestant Lord Chancellor, drafting legislation to smash Catholic altars, burn Catholic relics, and enforce Protestant doctrine, this should have been the absolute, inescapable end of the line. Queen Mary had a very long memory, and she knew exactly what Richard Rich had done. But Richard Rich possessed a survival instinct that bordered on the supernatural. He executed his final and perhaps most terrifying ideological pivot. He enthusiastically, shamelessly reinvented himself one more time. He discarded his Protestant convictions overnight and reverted entirely back to extreme, uncompromising Catholicism. He presented himself to Queen Mary not as a former Protestant leader, but as a loyal, obedient servant of the crown who had simply been forced to follow the horrific laws of the previous regime under the threat of death. Queen Mary, desperately needing experienced, ruthless local administrators to enforce her deeply unpopular religious purges in the volatile eastern counties, accepted his submission. She gave him a terrifying new job. Richard Rich was appointed as a senior commissioner for the persecution of heretics in his home county of Essex. The man who had been the chief architect of the Protestant legal code was now the chief inquisitor designed to burn the people who followed it. The era known to history as the Marian persecutions, which earned the Queen the moniker Bloody Mary, was a period of intense localized state terror. Nearly 300 men and women were burned alive at the stake for refusing to accept the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of communion literally become the physical body and blood of Christ. Richard Rich did not merely sign the death warrants from the comfort of his sprawling mansion at Lee's Priory. He actively, personally oversaw the horrors. He rode out into the towns of Essex, Colchester, Stratford, Manningtree, and Chelmsford to personally interrogate suspected Protestants. The psychological dissonance of this reality is staggering. Richard Rich sat on the judicial bench staring down at frightened, pious Protestant men and women and condemned them to the flames for believing the exact same theological doctrines that he had legally forced them to believe just 3 years prior. He was burning people for obeying his own laws. During one specific, highly documented execution in the town of Chelmsford, the sheer horror of Rich's hypocrisy was publicly confronted. A committed Protestant martyr named Thomas Watts was condemned to death by Rich's commission. Watts was led to the execution grounds, stripped of his outer clothing, and chained securely to a heavy wooden post surrounded by bundles of dried wood and reeds. Richard Rich, fulfilling his duties as the Queen's representative, was present at the execution. He sat comfortably on his heavily armored horse, surrounded by guards watching with cold bureaucratic detachment as the executioners brought the torches. As the faggots of wood were lit and the smoke began to violently rise around him, Thomas Watts did not weep or beg for his life. Instead, he looked directly through the rising flames and locked eyes with Richard Rich. Watts used his final agonizing breaths not to pray for himself, but to scream a terrifying prophetic warning at the man who had condemned him. According to the Protestant martyrologist John Fox, Watts screamed, "You, my Lord, are the cause of my death. I warn you, repent, for the vengeance of God will surely fall upon you for this innocent blood." Rich sat silently on his horse, his face an unreadable mask, and simply watched the man burn to ash. He believed in the power of the crown, the power of the law, and the power of real estate. He did not believe in the vengeance of God. But the brutal, blood-soaked regime of Queen Mary I was destined to be short-lived. The Queen was plagued by phantom pregnancies, a disastrous marriage to the King of Spain, and failing health. In November 1558, Queen Mary died, leaving no Catholic heir. The crown passed to her younger half-sister, the highly intelligent, deeply pragmatic, and Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. Richard Rich was now in his early 60s. He was an aging, fabulously wealthy aristocrat, but he was also a man who had tortured Protestants, burned Catholics, and then burned Protestants again. He knew perfectly well that his bloody, endlessly shifting past made him a massive, highly visible political liability to the new queen. Elizabeth I was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. She knew exactly how dangerous men like Richard Rich could be. He needed to survive this final transition of power, and he executed a master class in political neutralization. He made one final, highly calculated and brilliantly counterintuitive political move. In Queen Elizabeth's very first parliament in 1559, the new queen introduced the Act of Uniformity, a crucial piece of legislation designed to firmly reestablish the Protestant Church of England and sever ties with Rome once again. As a baron of the realm, Richard Rich sat in the House of Lords. When the vote was called, Rich actually voted against the Queen's bill. To the untrained eye, this seems like an act of political suicide for a survivor. Why would he antagonize the new Protestant queen by voting for Catholicism? But it was, in fact, a stroke of absolute genius. By voting against the bill in a peaceful, legal, parliamentary setting, Rich did not start an armed rebellion. He did not threaten the Queen's life. But he did manage to maintain a vital, crucial shred of conservative Catholic dignity. This calculated no vote allowed him to save face with his old, powerful, conservative, aristocratic allies in the House of Lords, men who might otherwise have sent an assassin to his estate for being a shameless, godless turncoat. He proved to them he was not entirely a creature of the new regime. Once that single strategic vote was cast, Richard Rich executed the final phase of his survival plan: complete, absolute political invisibility. He entirely withdrew from high politics. He did not seek a position on Elizabeth's Privy Council. He did not attend the glittering, highly competitive events at the royal court. He quietly, seamlessly packed up his London household and retired permanently to his massive, heavily fortified and stolen estates in the deep countryside of Essex. For the next 8 years, he was a ghost. He never raised an armed rebellion. He never spoke a single recorded treasonous word against the new queen. He managed his lands, collected his massive rents, and made himself entirely irrelevant to the daily operations of the Tudor state. By removing himself as a threat, he ensured that Queen Elizabeth, who was busy dealing with massive international crises and assassination plots, simply forgot about him. He vanished into the impenetrable fortress of his own immense wealth. History, literature, and human psychology rely heavily on the comforting illusion of ultimate cosmic justice. We desperately want to believe that a man who built an empire on perjury, torture, and the burning of innocent people will eventually face a horrific, agonizing downfall. We expect the villain to fall on his own sword, to be betrayed by his own children, or to rot in a dungeon. The final chapter of Richard Rich's life shatters that comfort completely. It forces us to look into the abyss of an unfair universe. Toward the very end of his life, sitting in his magnificent red brick mansion at Lee's Priory, Rich began to make preparations for his death. Perhaps he was finally suffering from a rare, terrifying pang of conscience as the ghosts of Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Askew, and Thomas Watts gathered in the dark corners of his mind. Or, much more likely, he was simply operating on the same transactional logic he had used his entire life. He was trying to financially bribe his way into heaven. He used a microscopic fraction of his immense, embezzled wealth for highly public acts of charity. In 1564, he founded Felsted School in Essex, an educational institution that still exists today. He also established several almshouses for the poor and the elderly in the surrounding villages. He ensured his name was carved into the stone of these buildings, a desperate, calculated attempt to scrub his bloody, treacherous legacy clean and by the mandatory prayers of the poor for his eternal soul. In his personal life, he was surprisingly successful. He had a long, stable marriage to Elizabeth Jenks. Together, they successfully fathered and raised at least 15 children, ensuring that the barony of Rich would survive for generations. He even had an illegitimate son, also named Richard, whom he openly, proudly acknowledged. He heavily funded this illegitimate son's education and trained him in the law, displaying a strange, almost human paternal affection that stood in stark, jarring contrast to his public sociopathy. His descendants thrived for 3 centuries. They became tightly, inextricably woven into the absolute highest echelons of the English aristocracy. His grandson, Robert Rich, would eventually become the immensely powerful second Earl of Warwick, a major colonial proprietor and admiral. The bloodline of the merchant's son had permanently infected the nobility Richard Rich, the first Baron Rich, died of natural causes on June 12, 1567. He was roughly 71 years old, an incredibly long lifespan for the violent, disease-ridden 16th century. He died peacefully, warmly tucked into a luxurious feather bed, surrounded by his numerous children, his loyal servants, and the staggering, unfathomable wealth he had stolen from the Catholic Church. He was buried in a magnificent, elaborately carved alabaster tomb at the Holy Cross Church in Felsted. The marble effigy depicts him resting peacefully, his hands clasped in prayer, looking like a righteous, honorable statesman, resting after a lifetime of noble service to the crown. The ultimate nauseating injustice of the Tudor era is stark, undeniable, and deeply depressing. Brilliant, principled visionaries like Sir Thomas More died under the executioner's axe, their heads boiled and spiked on London Bridge. Administrative geniuses like Thomas Cromwell were betrayed, humiliated, and beheaded in the dirt. Brave innocents like Anne Askew died screaming in unspeakable agony in the roaring flames of Smithfield. Their lives were cut violently, brutally short specifically because they stood for something larger than themselves. But the perjurer, the torturer, the embezzler, the coward, and the ultimate traitor died peacefully in his sleep, holding all the gold. While the flawed, easily manipulated historical and legal record of the 16th century allowed Richard Rich to completely escape the executioner's block in life, modern culture and literature have relentlessly prosecuted him in death. Since he escaped the king's justice, we have locked him in a permanent, inescapable public cage of disgust. His historical legacy serves as a continuous public indictment, firmly cemented in the modern consciousness by the 1966 film A Man for All Seasons. The narrative utilizes actor John Hurt to expose Rich's calculated moral decay, meticulously documenting his transition from a low-ranking scholar into a state-sponsored perjurer. Sir Thomas More, portrayed by Paul Scofield, looks at his betrayer not with hatred, but with devastating pity, delivering a line that summarizes the empty reality of Rich's existence. Why Richard? It profits a man nothing to give his soul for the whole world, but for Wales. In the television series The Tudors, actor Rod Hallett presents Rich as a cold, unfeeling administrative machine. This adaptation forces the audience to witness the horrific reality of Tudor law in action, recreating the precise moment Rich removes his coat to physically crank the rack and tear Anne Askew apart. It stands as a stark reminder that state bureaucrats can act as the most ruthless executioners. Furthermore, in the BBC adaptation of Hilary Mantel's historical novel Wolf Hall, Brian Dick portrays Rich as a highly dangerous sycophant. He is depicted as a man who constantly lurks in the shadows of powerful figures, taking notes and waiting for the exact moment of vulnerability to betray the patron who elevated him. Richard Rich forces us to confront a very dark, deeply uncomfortable, and highly relevant truth about how the world actually works, both in the absolute monarchies of the 16th century and in the corporate, political, and legal power structures of today. We desperately want to believe that integrity, brilliance, loyalty, and moral courage are the true keys to a successful life. We want to believe that evil men are inevitably punished by a just universe, that karma will eventually balance the books. But Richard Rich definitively proves that in a corrupted, highly volatile, an entirely transactional system, the man who survives is not the man with the strongest morals. The man who survives is the man who is entirely, unapologetically willing to discard them. He was a man completely devoid of an internal moral compass. He viewed human beings entirely as stepping stones, and he viewed the law entirely as a weapon of personal advancement. He won the deadly game of Tudor survival. He got the land, he got the title, and he got to die of old age. But to win the world, he had to entirely permanently forfeit his humanity. He is the ultimate historical proof that sometimes the villains get away with it.